Have you ever had a secret too big to keep? A long time ago, let's be serious, a long time ago, I graduated from high school in East Texas. And when that happened, I wondered if I would ever again see my good friend Charlie Everest. You see, I was going out to Lubbock to Texas Tech to study because those flat plains and that broad sky suited me real well. And Charlie, he was going to Tulane in New Orleans, where there were fetid swamps, but jazz and good food and mystery and magic, and that suited Charlie real well. Well, I graduated from Tech with a law degree, and then I came back to Dallas, Texas, and I went to work in the district attorney's office where I was a prosecutor of child abuse cases. And Charlie, he graduated with a doctorate in psychology, and he became Dr. Charles Everest, and he opened a family therapy clinic in New Orleans. And, you know, we remained friends during all that period of separation. At first, some of you are old enough to remember, we actually, as poor college students, wrote letters and mailed them to each other. But later, we communicated by telephone and by email, and whenever we were in the same city, we always got together. Well, a number of years ago, I was in New Orleans for an education conference. So, of course, Charlie and I got together for dinner, and we had a wonderful dinner. And then as the evening wore on, we engaged in some spirited conversation, as you can imagine. And at that point, Charlie told me a story. And I provoked that because I had recapped with him what he already knew about how I had totally burned out on the law as a child abuse prosecutor, and I had decided to become a teacher. And I said to Charlie, you know, you stare into that darkness every day, Charlie. Do you think someday you're going to hang it up too and stop doing that? And he leaned across the table and he stared at me and he said, you know, when I was at Tulane, I took a course, and in order to fulfill one of the course requirements, I volunteered at a nursing home. And my first day at that nursing home, I introduced myself to one of the residents, and that resident said, my name is Toby, just Toby. I gave away my last name a long time ago, and Charlie thought that guy probably was from the memory care unit. But when he went and checked the file, he was completely wrong. And I have to tell you, I find it very odd. I think Charlie did too. With the vast difference between Charlie's age and Toby's age, the two of them became friends. Now, Toby had no surviving family members. So when Charlie got a telephone call from the nursing home that Toby was dying, he rushed to his friend's bedside. And there, Toby told him a story. And the night we had dinner together, Charlie told me that story. And this is what Charlie said Toby told him. I did not cry when Daddy died, not a single tear. Don't think I'm a monster. I cried when my father died. Now, I was a baby and I was too young to remember, but my sister Claire, she was 5, and she told me all about it, how Mama on that day rocked me in her arms, and I matched her wail for wail, salty tear for salty tear. When I was 11, Mama was dating again, and that's how Fred Collins came into our lives. Now, Fred seemed to make my mother happy, so my sister Claire and I were not surprised one day when Mom and Fred sat us down and they told us that they were going to be married. And that's when Fred told us that he was going to adopt us. He said, "Then you'll be my children, mine, and I want you to call me Daddy." Daddy, he was a tall man and strong, and he appeared congenial to everyone. He had black hair and penetrating green eyes, and Daddy, he stank. He stank because he smoked one cigarette after another. He was a Marlboro man, but he didn't keep them in the pack that you bought them in. He had a fancy silver cigarette case. It had engraved lines around each head, 3 engraved lines, and on the lid it had his initials engraved. He kept it in the inner pocket of his jacket. Daddy, he wanted to be thought well of by everyone, and so he would flash that silver cigarette case to impress them. Daddy, being a smoker, also had in his hip pocket a white handkerchief. When nobody was looking, he would pull that out and cough and spit into it and rapidly put it back in his pocket. Now, Daddy, because he stank, when he tried to hug me, I would sometimes wince, and that made him really mad. It seemed like after the marriage and the adoption were over and some months had passed, everything seemed to make Daddy mad. And that's when the darkness crept into our household. One morning, Mama was fixing my breakfast, and when she turned around from the sink, I saw that scarlet mark under her eye, the beginning of a black eye. And when I asked her, she said, "Oh, I'm so clumsy." And later, when I saw those 5 marks on her upper arm, those bruises, she said, "I had an accident." And when I asked her about those bruises I saw on her legs, she said, I tripped and fell. Out of the earshot of Mama and Claire, Daddy yelled at me all the time. "You stupid boy, this mess is your fault. Stop your sniveling and be a man. I wouldn't have to whoop you if you do what I told you to. I'm doing this because I love you." I think the words hurt me more than the slaps and the punches and the kicks. One night, I got up in the middle of the night because I had to go to the bathroom, and I stepped out into the hallway, and I saw Daddy coming out of Claire's room. His face was flushed and sweaty, and when he saw me, he grinned, and he put his finger to his lips, and he said, "Shh." And I ran back to my room, and I held it almost bursting until the first dawn of sun, and then I felt safe to go to the bathroom. After that night, my beautiful sister, she changed. Mama got so mad when she cut off her long blonde hair. She did it in her bedroom with a pair of shears. And she didn't want to eat much of anything. And she took to wearing baggy clothes with long sleeves. And she didn't bathe real regular anymore. And when I said, "Claire, what's wrong?" she said, "Nothing, mind your own business." So I did for a while. But after a few weeks, one day, I went to her room to borrow some notebook paper for school, and I pushed open her door, and I saw Claire. She was sitting on her bed, and she had those long sleeves pushed up, and in her hand she had a razor blade, and in those long sleeves pushed up, I saw the scars on her arm and one fresh slash still bleeding. And when I said, "Claire," she said, "Shh, don't tell. Don't tell. This pain takes away the other pain. Please don't tell." I loved my sister, so I didn't tell. But that was when the darkness completely consumed our house. Daddy had brought that darkness into our house. He had brought lies and violence and evil and silence. But you know, when evil flows out of a source, sometimes it turns around and flows right back in. One day, Daddy was home, and he began to cough, and he reached for his handkerchief, and when he coughed into his handkerchief, I saw the dark, dark crimson. And Daddy coughed, and he coughed, and he coughed, and he coughed until Mama called the ambulance and they took Daddy off to the hospital. And he never came home. I did not cry at his funeral, not a single tear. And our house, it changed again. That stench, it dissipated or was scrubbed away, and bruises began to fade, and hurts began to heal, and in our house again there was talking and at least smiles, and we were a family again. Charlie said at that point in the story, Toby closed his eyes. And Charlie thought his friend had finished, and he reached out and touched his hand, but as soon as he touched his hand, Toby's eyes snapped open, and he continued talking like he had never paused. It was months later when I woke up in the middle of the night, and I knew something was bad wrong, because I smelled smoke. I smelled cigarette smoke. I smelled Marlboro smoke. And I went out into the hallway, and I saw Daddy. He was hovering outside of Claire's room. He didn't look the way he did when he was alive. He was kind of hazy and indistinct and gray. But again, that finger came to his lips, and he said, shh. And I wanted to run. I told my legs to move, but they were frozen, and I wanted to scream, but all I did was gape my mouth wide open, and Daddy floated toward me, and he took his hand and grabbed the back of my neck. His hand was cold and ashen, but it was still strong. And he held me there, and he bent over my gaping mouth, and he began to blow a putrid vapor into my mouth, and it burned my mouth and my throat and my lungs. And when it went into my heart, I knew what he was doing. He was putting his poison into me. He was putting his corruption into me, and I must have moaned. And that's when Claire came out of her room, and she said, "You leave him alone. I'll tell. And Daddy reached for Claire, but before he could touch her, Mama came out of her room, and she said, "You get away from them. This is it. I'll tell. Now, Daddy, he always wanted to be thought well of. And hearing those words under his roof, words he had never heard before, it diminished him. And he began to shrink and shrivel, and when his hand slipped off the back of my neck, I began to cough and say, I'll tell. And Daddy shrank and shrank and shrank until he was nothing but a pile of ash on the hallway floor. And our mother pulled us away from that and ran into her room, and she came out with that silver cigarette box. And she knelt on the floor, and she scooped every crumb of that ash into that cigarette box. And while she was kneeling, she pulled off her wedding ring and dropped it into that box. And she said, "With this ring I once was bound, now it will encircle and hold you down. You are bound. You are bound." And then she stood up and presented the case to Claire and said, "You got to offer something." Mama's eyes welled up when Claire pulled back the sleeves of her nightgown, and Mama saw those old scars, and Claire began to scratch at one until it began to bleed, and then she held it over and let the blood drip into the case. And Claire said, "Maiden's blood again is spilt, midst your ashes and ringed guilt. This will hold you down. You are bound. You are bound." And Mama turned to me, and I didn't even have to think. I spat in that case, and I said, "My innocence I reclaim. Give back your poison. I give back your name to hold you down. You are bound. You are bound." And Mama snapped that case shut, and we followed her out into our backyard under the starry sky and a horned moon. And Mama dug a hole underneath the oak tree in our backyard, and she put that case there and covered it up as we continued to chant, "You are bound, you are bound." We were a family that knew the power of secrets, and we swore we would never reveal this one. Charlie said, at that point, Toby's breath became very shallow and his eyes began to glaze, but he told Charlie he was scared. He was scared with Mother gone and Claire gone and him dying, that binding curse would be broken and Daddy would rise again. And that's when Charlie made a promise to his friend, a promise so he could die in peace. It was not easy in post-Katrina for Charlie to keep his promise, but there were still landmarks and there were still records, and he had talked with Charlie about Charlie's boyhood, and so Charlie did find the ruins of Toby's boyhood home, and in the backyard, a dead oak. And he got a shovel out of his car, and he went and he poked around under that tree until he smelled cigarette smoke, and there he dug. Now, he expected that cigarette case being buried so long it would be tarnished black as a corrupted heart. But when he uncovered it and dusted the dirt off and held it up in the midday sun, it gleamed like it was brand new. And so Charlie knew that binding spell had survived death. He told me he put that case in a place where it would be perpetually undisturbed. Told me it was a safe place. Told me it was a sacred place, but he didn't tell me where it was, and I'm just as glad he didn't. But Charlie knew from his current occupation, and I knew from my farmer one, that you can't look at and touch that kind of evil without it affecting you. It had almost destroyed me before I stopped practicing law and started teaching. But Charlie, he told me he had turned that curse to his advantage, because Charlie, my friend, he worked with people who were suffering with their secrets. He taught them how to heal through their secrets. And he told me him touching that cigarette case, that evil cigarette case, had changed him. From that day forward, whenever he encountered someone who was holding close that secret of domestic abuse, he knew immediately. He didn't even have to hear a word from them. If he would reach out and shake their hand, in that instant, he said, his nostrils would be filled with smoke, and his mouth a taste of ashes.